So this video is going to cover the United States in World War I a little bit, but we're mostly going to focus on the United States during the treaty negotiations and how we influence them. So our objectives, we want to understand the background information, where we were in the war, how we got involved, and then we want to look at especially President Wilson's ideas and goals and the reason that the peace did not go as planned according to President Wilson. So, American troops are going to fight primarily, pretty much all of them will be sent to the Western Front in France and Belgium. Now, think of the Western Front as the big show. This is the area where all the new weapons get kind of deployed and displayed. It's Germany versus Britain and France and the Belgians. This is where the trench warfare is. It is a stalemate, pretty much all the way since 1914. It's been a stalemate, with these massive trench lines and fortifications running all the way from the north of France to the Swiss border. It's not an unbroken line of trenches, but it might as well be. The other side of the war at this point is the Eastern Front. This is with Russia, Poland, Austria-Hungary. It's mostly the Germans and the Austrians fighting the Russians and the Romanians. But what happens, and this is really important to understanding the background of America's entry, is this Russian Revolution. So Russia has a revolution in 1917. It brings the communists to power, and the Russians exit the war. As a result, what Germany begins doing is they begin dumping all of their troops onto the Western Front. The Germans had a bigger army than both the French and the British at this time. They were probably a better army as well, and it becomes a race. Can the Germans successfully knock the British and French out of the war, or are the Americans going to be able to get enough soldiers in to kind of turn the battle? So you got to think we're rushing to get our army over into France. So the Western Front is right here. If you look at the red line, it runs through Belgium, northern France, and down to the Swiss border. That's pretty much where the war has been all the way since 1914. The Eastern Front is over here. So it was like in this area. When the Germans are able to knock the Russians out of the war, the Germans begin shipping all their troops over to here, and the idea is they're going to make one last push, take Paris, knock France out of the war, knock Britain out of the war, and then Germany would be the ones who pretty much could control Europe at that point. What happens, though, is something much different. In April, American Expeditionary Force, that's what they called it, but it was our army, arrives in France. And about every day, 10,000 American troops just came off the boats in France. They weren't immediately sent to the front. They had to train, obviously. We had not gone through trench warfare, so the French army would train our soldiers for a while. But it does begin to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. We're at some key battles where we stopped the German army from taking Paris, and then we're at some battles where we actually launch attacks of our own against the Germans and begin pushing them back towards Germany. So the important things, this is really important for the future. This is the first time American troops are sent overseas to defend a country that is really not directly in the interest of the United States. We weren't being attacked. We weren't being invaded. It wasn't a war in North America, but it was that idea of, again, spreading democracy, spreading safety. The American military grows. We originally only had an army of about 50,000 soldiers. By the end of the war, we have 4 million. Now, that won't stay like that. We decrease our army after the war, but it does show that we are able to build a competent force. We get experience with tanks. We get experience with modern naval warfare. We get experience with our Air Force, and we begin to see that we need to upgrade our military. As a result of this, the Europeans begin to see the United States as more of a military power. We were always seen as a strong nation, but our army really was the difference in World War I. And without it, probably Germany would have been able to defeat the French, if not the British, near the end of the war. So the main part we're going to focus on is actually making the peace at the end of the war. This is the most important piece. This is what's tested on the OST the most. So if you have any questions about this, I would definitely encourage you to ask them. So in 1919, after the war, the major powers know they have to sign a peace treaty. There was an armistice with ended the fighting, but there is not a peace treaty yet. So they come together for the Paris Peace Conference. And the Paris Peace Conference's goal is to find a way to end the war.
for all parties. But there's some issues. First and foremost, the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire are not invited. And then Russia is not invited as well. So you have a full over half of the war that just wasn't invited to the peace conference. The peace conference is now only going to be the victors of the war. It's going to be the Allied side. This immediately sets it up for failure because you're not getting all parts of the war. Even though, like, Germany was never invaded during the war. They didn't feel like they were defeated. They thought they were more negotiating an end. At the peace conference, there's a disagreement over what should be in the treaty. The U.S. wants the peace based on the 14 points, that idea that Wilson has to prevent another war. Self-determination, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, those things. Britain wants to return to the status quo. They were the most powerful nation on the planet before the war. They want to go back to how everything was before the war. They will stay the most powerful. They'll be able to rebuild their economy, rebuild their empire. France, they want Germany weakened so it can't threaten France again. Germany has invaded France now, I think, 3 times in the space of over less than 100 years. So they want Germany to never be a threat again. Italy and Japan, they were promised territory in exchange for joining the war. They want that territory. You can see that these don't go together very well. Britain and France, doesn't work because Germany was second to Britain, and Britain's fine with that. U.S., they want the peace based on the 14 points. They're not just going to give land to the Italians and the Japanese. It has to be based on where that land should go, what people live there. So all of these things, they don't go together, and it's going to cause the treaty to be a bad treaty. This is one of the few times in history that I can tell you it was objectively a bad treaty. Treaty of Versailles, which comes out of this peace conference, causes World War I, or World War II. So the American peace plan, Wilson had said that he wanted peace without victory. The idea that we end the war, that was the goal of the war, just end the war, end the killing. And he wanted to use the 14 points to then make it so there would not be another war. The 14 points are kind of a framework for keeping the peace. The 14 points, in their most basic, they promote openness, things like trade, getting countries to trade with each other so they're reliant on each other, so they're less likely to go to war. Self-determination, which is a very important vocab word where nations get to pick their own government. So the idea of who should rule the Polish, who should rule the Estonians, who should rule the French. And his idea is that if people have their own governments, they're not going to have a reason to fight with their neighbors because they do what they want. He wants freedom. He wants to spread democracy. He openly said that. And he also wants disarmament, the idea that actually getting rid of weapons, not having as many battleships, not having as many machine guns or tanks or bombers or whatever. That way, countries are less likely to lean towards war. They don't have that stuff. They're not ready for a war. They may not use it. The last piece, and this one's the really important one to the debate you're going to go over, is the League of Nations. The League of Nations is this kind of pre-UN. The idea is that all nations will join the League of Nations together, and they will all act kind of in a defensive alliance. So if one nation attacks a member in the League, it's like all nations in the League have been attacked, and they'll all fight as one. And his idea is, one, this gives nations an area to discuss problems instead of using war to solve them. And two, if a nation does go to war, all the other nations in the League will fight together, and they can squash that war before it grows into a big one. So the Treaty of Versailles, you definitely need to know this, is the result of the peace conference, and it had some issues immediately. One, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war. Germany lost all its colonies. They could only have a military of 100,000 men. They were limited on how many machine guns, U-boats, tanks, airplanes, battleships they could have. They had to pay reparations that were worth more than their entire economy. Couldn't afford to even pay them. And Germans are surprised because they were told they didn't lose the war. Remember, Germany wasn't invaded, so they don't know what's going on. Self-determination, that idea that a group of people should only have their own government, should have their own government, is only for Europe. They don't do it in Africa with the colonies. They don't do it in the Middle East with the former Ottoman Empire. They only do it for the European countries. That makes the colonies mad, makes the people in the Middle East mad. The Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, they just disappear. They dissolve. They're gone. They're not really given a choice. They're already breaking up, but they're gone. It creates chaos in that part of the world. One of the good things, the League of Nations is created. It's created, but as we're going to see at the next part, there's a major problem with it. So these are supposed to be the Treaty of Versailles. This is supposed to be the Allies, and this is supposed to be Germany. And it's like it's a hard pill to swallow. The Germans are very surprised at how harsh the peace treaty is towards them. They thought it was more just kind of an old-fashioned war where everybody fought, and then at the end they made a treaty. They didn't expect this like hatred from the Allies, especially the French. So now we switch to the United States. In the United States, the Treaty of Versailles is unpopular, especially with our Congress. The reason that our Congress doesn't like it, and the main thing that you have to understand to do the debate, is Article 10. That is not Article X, it's Article 10, Roman numeral 10. And this is in the treaty, and it's part of the League of Nations. So Article 10 is part of the treaty and part of the League of Nations. And what it says is it's the clause that if any member in the League of Nations is attacked, the other members all have to come to their aid automatically. The United States had traditionally kind of left the rest of the world alone. So Congress was worried that it would make the U.S. give up its ability to choose to go to war. Because this clause said automatically you have to go to war. If you're in the league and another member is attacked, you have to go to war. So we have two groups formed. The irreconcilables, these are people who they just hate the Treaty of Versailles. They hate the League. They're totally against Article 10. They're not going to vote for the treaty no matter what. They say it's not a good treaty for the United States. We'll make a separate treaty with Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and end our part of the war. The reservationists are led by a very powerful senator, Henry Cabot Lodge. He wants changes to the treaty. He says, listen, I don't hate all the treaty. I don't like Article 10. If we can have these parts of the treaty changed where we can sit out that piece, then we'll vote for the treaty. And their main concern, again, is that Article 10 would take away Congress's ability to declare war, because Congress in the U.S. Constitution is the government piece that declares war. They're worried that by signing on to the League of Nations, signing the Treaty of Versailles, and having Article 10, the U.S. will have to go to war whenever there's a war, and it won't allow us to choose if it's in our interest to go to war. So Wilson traveled across the country. He gave speeches. He tried to drum up support for the treaty and the League. It just didn't work. The treaty went to the Senate. It was defeated, and the United States did not sign the treaty. So we didn't join the League. So the big thing here is this is an American idea that was put in the Treaty of Versailles. It's directly from Wilson's 14 points, and then we don't join. The big thing is Europe is broke at this time. They literally have lost a whole generation of men. They don't have any money. Their militaries are in shambles. The idea is that America would kind of be the muscle for the League of Nations. Without us, the League isn't able to enforce anything it says, and the League is going to fail. And that's what we're going to see is Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo over in Japan. They take advantage of the League's weakness, and they begin kind of like pressing their luck and seeing what they can get away with until the League just completely falls apart. So this poster, or this political cartoon, it's supposed to be like what's wrong with the League. So the League is the bridge here. That's all the nations that are joining in. And if you know anything about architecture, to build an arch, you have to have a keystone, and that's the stone in the middle that holds everything together, so it doesn't collapse. And you can see the keystone is the United States. Uncle Sam, he's leaning on it. We're not joining the League, and the League is going to collapse in on itself. So if you have any questions, please let me know. This should help you with the League of Nations debate and help you kind of understand why we did not join and stepped away kind of from being involved with Europe's affairs.